Welcome, welcome. It's good seeing y'all, and I'm glad you're listening in. This is East Meets West, an integrative approach to men's health. My name is Michael Johnson. I've been practicing acupuncture for 15 years now, and I work a lot with men's health issues. I work a lot with pain, anxiety, depression, which is a good one that we're discussing today. And with me is Dr. May.
Hey guys, Dr. May here. I'm a naturopathic physician, board certified in endocrinology, and most of my practice is endocrine disorders. I do see a fair amount of men, and I also do regenerative medicine injections as well. So excited to always be here, guys, and love that we're just having this conversation each time about men's health issues. Oftentimes these don't get addressed because, guys, I know we're not so good at taking care of ourselves health wise. So anyway, glad to jump into this conversation on depression today.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this one. I'm part of a lot of men's groups on Facebook, and what I've noticed regularly is that guys will talk about depression, sometimes moderate or mild depression, sometimes very severe, on these groups anonymously, because they say they don't feel like that they can talk about it with loved ones. They don't feel like they can talk about it with their doctor. So this is a really big issue that does not get discussed because a lot of guys just don't feel like that they're allowed to, kind of like last week's. And so I think this is really important, Dr. May.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I've seen the same thing. Talking with friends, seeing patients in person, it's rare to hear a guy like just come out and say, "Hey, I'm struggling with this," or, "What do you think about this?" Usually, especially for me in the office, I have to really poke and prod quite a bit, and have to develop a decent relationship with guys for them to actually open up about this subject. But I've seen the same thing online as well. I'm part of a few men's groups, and it's just you see a ton more of this on those groups, guys just kind of reaching out, going, "Man, I'm really struggling. I'm having suicidal thoughts, or I'm just
Mhm.
really depressed, or like, what do I do? I have no idea like where to go from here."
Yeah, no, exactly. And not only do I see it in men's groups, but I see it in practice too. So my undergrad is actually in psychology, and I have a great love for psychology. And so I spent 4 years studying anxiety, depression, bipolar, and so I try to work that a lot into my practice because this is something, especially with guys, that just doesn't get talked about enough. So I'm excited about hearing some numbers and
Yeah.
statistics because I know that you are always ready with the numbers and statistics. So tell us about
I uh, I do like pulling out the stats. Because, every time we talk about a subject, my first question is always like, well, how prevalent is this? How much of this is really like out there, and how significant is it on our health? So let me throw a few stats at you guys. So the CDC reports that about 13.3% of men have been diagnosed with some form of depression at some point in their lives. Now, granted, I think most of these are going to be very conservative numbers.
it.
One, because most men don't go to their physicians or their healthcare providers to be diagnosed. And two, if they are to, you know, divulge this kind of information, usually it's not until it gets pretty bad.
Yep.
Next up is, according to a 2023 Gallup survey, 29% of US adults reported being diagnosed with depression in their lifetime. That's up from 19.6 back in 2015. So that's all adults, not just men. But you can see that huge jump. That's a 10% jump in that period of time in
Mhm.
less than 10 years. Granted, we had the pandemic during that time period. So it's not surprising that it did go up, but still 10% from a full like US population. That's a huge amount of people.
It is.
Um, yeah. And then the percentage of adults currently experiencing or being treated for depression increased from 10.5% in 2015 to 17.8% in 2023. So again, this kind of corresponds with that previous number. It's a pretty big jump there. It's a little bit more than 7% jump just in people who are being treated.
Hmm.
And then lifetime depression rates in men increased from 17.7% in 2017 to 20.4% in 2023. Again, not too much of an increase there. I mean, it's almost 3%, but at the same time, I'd speculate that this is probably pretty conservative. And interesting, this is really kind of what what astonished me was young adults ages 18 to 29, their lifetime depression rates increased from 20.4% to 34.3%. So you're
Wow.
seeing a 14 point, percentage rate increase there in that time period. And that's just in a 6-year time period. So
Yeah.
those are pretty significant. That's like I said, for men especially, I think those are really conservative numbers, and even being conservative, that's still alarming.
Oh, it is. And I agree. Completely conservative. A lot of the doctors I've met, and I'm not insulting doctors, I've met some really amazing doctors, but from a psychology point of view, with my background, most of them do not properly ask the right questions. They don't really use the DSM to diagnose anything. Oh yeah, you're feeling a little bit down. If the guy tells them they're feeling down, which often they won't,
Yeah.
okay, let's just give you an SSRI and see what happens. That's what I
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
commonly, as
Yeah.
opposed to proper
Yeah.
diagnosis.
Right. Yeah, I agree. They get thrown out like candy a lot of times without us understanding truly like what's the cause of this depression.
Hmm.
Is it situational, or is it metabolic, or there are a lot of different causes for depression, and sometimes we don't even have a good sense of what depression is. Like
Yep.
it's actually pretty tough to define that term oftentimes. And so we can kind of like categorize it in a way, but at the same time, it's difficult. So you really have to get a lot of information and dive kind of deeper in there to kind of figure out where that root issue is. And that's
Hmm.
tough. And it's tough for guys to admit to, they have a problem, and to seek help for that problem.
Yeah, and once we get to treatments, I want to talk a little bit about my perspective on SSRIs, but we'll wait till we get there. I get a little excited about that topic, so we'll wait till we get there.
Sure. For sure. One thing I do want to kind of point out too is guys who get depressed, they're more likely to commit suicide. And we know men have a much higher prevalence of suicide than women do. So let me throw some stats out there for you. In 2022, the age adjusted suicide rate for males was 23 per 100,000. That's
Oh,
compared to 5.9 for females. 5.9 for females versus 23 for men. That's a substantial difference.
it is.
Also, the suicide rate for males is like 3 to 4 times higher than that for females. Suicide is the 11th leading cause of death overall in the US, but it's the second leading cause for those between the ages of 10 and 34. So, again, it's showing us like there's a higher prevalence towards men, and even so for younger people, especially men, young men. And so we had to ask the question, like, why is that? Why are young men especially taking their lives at a much higher rate?
And I've seen some research on this, and for a lot of it also has to do with method.
Mhm.
Not always. Let me say this is a generalization, so anybody listening, like, don't get mad at me. But but for women, a lot of times, it's going to be not always, but there's going to be a cry for help where it's like, they may take pills or something, where there's still a little bit more of a chance of like, okay, you find them. Yes, there was a suicide attempt, but for guys, it's a lot more often something that is much harder to help. I mean, if somebody uses a gun, or some of these other methods, by the time you find them, it's going to be too late. And so a lot of
Yeah,
it is also method, I think, as much as anything. And also just the differences of, like, if a guy gets to that point, they've already thought through everything, and they're at that point, whereas you aren't going to talk
yeah,
them out of it.
yeah, yeah. They're much more likely to be successful in their suicide
That's it.
attempt.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I know. And yeah, I came across that. I guess I didn't write it down, but there was like a pretty significant difference between the use of like more aggressive techniques, like using a gun when trying to commit suicide, versus pills and other things like that that aren't as successful.
And it's heartbreaking
Yeah.
to me because it's like a lot of it is if a guy would talk to somebody like you or somebody like me and just get some treatment options, a lot of this could be abated before it even happens. And so that's one reason I'm really excited about this subject. I think it's important
Yeah.
because, we can help before it gets to that point. And this is essential. This is essential for guys everywhere. This is essential for you and me. It's essential stuff. So I'm just so excited that we're bringing this up because this is so important.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true, man. It's, you just gotta ask the question, like, why, what is it that's driving this? Why do guys not want to reach out for help? Like, is this just kind of the stereotypical, like, hey, I'm a man, I'm a real man, so I don't need help. I don't need to ask for help because that's a sign of weakness if I do. Is it that? Is it just because we don't really like do a good job of taking care of our health, so we don't really know what resources are available for this kind of stuff? I
Mhm.
don't know. What do you
I
think,
think it's a
Mike?
mix. I think it's a mix. I think that some of this is built into our culture. And I'll share a little bit of a personal story. I like to be personal on here. I struggled with severe depression as a teenager. And I never sought help. I never talked to anyone about it ever. Suicidal ideation, all that. And I would never talk to anybody because in my mind, it's, I'm going to be written off or they're going to think I'm crazy. They're going to lock me up somewhere if I tell them this. And so I'm just
Mhm,
like, I'm going to do what guys do, which is I'm going to figure out how to deal with this on my own. And either I will or I won't. And if I don't, then
mhm,
that'll be it. And I think that it's that mentality that's kind of built into our society. I mean, even now, I'll tell people since my divorce and even before, it's like, yeah, I see counselor every week to every 2 weeks for 3 years now. And
mhm.
it's been awesome. I love my counselor. It's great. But when I say that, there's a look, especially from a lot of guys, of like, you're talking to somebody about this. Like, there's this weird look of like, what are you doing, dude? And then the women
Yeah,
I talk to is like, that's awesome. I'm so glad you're seeing a counselor. And it's almost always a very
yeah,
different response from the guys I talk to.
yeah, yeah, and I don't know about you too, I've done plenty of counseling as well, and it's extremely helpful, but,
Mhm.
it's like, why do we think that's weakness, right? And the way I see it too is by having a professional kind of help walk me through some of that stuff, give me tools to help me kind of deal with stress in a more positive way instead of developing these sort of negative coping skills like alcohol and whatever else that we put in there, because we all do it. We're all going to figure out some coping mechanism for stress, and it's either going to be a positive one or a negative one. And I think guys, we tend to gravitate towards negative ones because we don't develop good coping skills. And
Yeah.
so that's part of like just giving yourself better tools to be able to handle the stresses of life, because we can put on a lot. Again, this kind of goes back to that mentality of like, I'm strong, I'm a man, I'm going to just put my head down and deal with it no matter what kind of stress comes my way. And so
Mhm.
I'm just going to put it on my shoulders and keep moving on. And that's not a great way to kind of deal with this, because eventually it's going to break your back and it's going to break you in more ways than you know. And
Yep.
if you don't have good tools, good coping skills, you're more likely to be in this kind of situation and be depressed and maybe even think suicide.
Yeah. And I think that part of it also probably has to do with now whether or not this is actually a rise in autism or if it's a rise in diagnosis of autism. But I do think that, for years, like when in the 80s, I'm going to show my age here. In the 80s, if you had ADD, which I did, and I still do, if you can't tell, then it was just like, the treatment for ADD when I was a kid was a slap upside the head. That's the joke. Is like, stop moving around so much, stop talking, slap upside the
Yep.
head. deal with it.
Mhm.
And you
Mhm.
know, if somebody was autistic, unless they were severely like nonverbal autistic, it's just like, well, you still got to go to school and you still got to figure this out. So the help
Mhm.
that I was taught when I was a kid is that there is no help. You figure it out on your own, because there's, you know, you're going to get a slap in the head and nothing else. And so people in our generation, that's going to be part of their response, is like, well, why am I going to seek
Mhm.
help? Because your whole childhood, that was the help you
Yeah,
got, which was no help.
that's true. That's true. Yeah. I read a book years ago. I think it was while I was in med school. It was called Emotional Intelligence. I think the guy's
Oh,
name is Daniel Goleman, if I remember right.
yeah.
Anyway, it was illuminating. It was just like being able to identify like your emotions and where they're coming from, what they mean. Like we have emotional intelligence just like we do just sort of regular intelligence, right? And they're two completely different sort of issues. And we don't often like work on our emotional intelligence, that emotional IQ, as much as we would say like our regular IQ, right? And it's
Yeah.
just the same way. Like it is something that you have to work on to improve upon. Like you're kind of given like that foundational level, if you will, but you can always improve it. And we don't really work on improving our emotional IQ or even know what it is most of the time.
Absolutely. And I will point out that if you're a guy listening to this and you're like, well, this podcast isn't for me, and you have anger issues, then you most likely have underlying depression and grief that's causing the anger issues. So, from a
Yeah.
psychological perspective, anger is not a primary emotion, it comes from something else,
Mhm.
almost always deep grief, depression, something else that's driving it. So, if you are a guy that just blows up, you're fine, and then you blow up, you probably actually do have some underlying depression that is not being dealt with, or other emotional things that are driving that anger. So if you're listening and saying that's not me and you're very angry, I would definitely recommend listening to the rest of the episode.
Dude, that's a great point. Yes, anger is a secondary emotion. And I think that was something I learned a few years ago. And when I did, man, it was a game changer. Because
Mhm.
now every time I get upset or mad, I'm like, all right, what's that coming from? Like I'm mad for some other reason. Like what's connected to that? And it makes you kind of dive into that deeper, which is great.
Mhm. And that's something I love about Chinese medicine. If it's okay, since you talked a little bit about statistics, I want to jump a little bit into
Mhm.
diagnosis, if that's all right.
Yeah.
But in Chinese medicine, it's not just depression. Now, there is a term for depression in Chinese medicine called yuzheng, Yuzheng. But
Mhm.
um, what you're really looking for is what's the underlying cause of the depression. So if somebody has a lot of irritability and anger, and there's depression underneath, we say it's liver qi stagnation. Now that's a
Mhm.
fancy ancient term.
It's not kidney, huh? Just it's
Not
liver.
kidney for once, it's liver.
Yeah, nice.
But if you think about all the organs of the body, the liver is the one that beats up on everything else in Chinese medicine. It just beats up on everything. And
Mm,
what it is, when you say stagnation, think about a hose that gets a kink in it. So you have energy and blood that's moving as it should, and there's a hose with a kink, and it builds up pressure.
mm,
And all this back pressure starts causing irritability, anger, outbursts, but it's all because you're not getting a proper flow. And so you're actually not getting as much in front because it's kinked up. You're not getting flow. So the whole
mhm,
idea is that it's getting depressed, it's getting blocked, and then it starts affecting other organs. And then you start having digestive issues, which is spleen and stomach, which a lot of people who
mhm,
have depression, you're also going to have some digestive issues because you have that constant worry and things that are coming up. So
mm.
it's not a primary thing. It's like it all starts with things are not flowing properly. Maybe you're not getting your emotions out. It blocks things up. And then it starts to affect other organ systems, and it gets bigger and bigger.
Yeah, nice. That makes complete sense. I mean, I think a lot of times anxiety and depression go kind of hand in hand. Like they
Yes.
can kind of alternate back and forth, and kind of be cyclical. And I tell you this from just as a personal note here, I've struggled with panic attacks in the past, And when you kind of describe that kink and that buildup of pressure, that's exactly how it feels. Like
Mhm.
I can feel like if I'm kind of close to having a panic attack, it feels like a tea kettle that's just getting like building up pressure and getting ready to blow. It's like,
Yeah.
all right, so I've got to, when I feel that now, like I have a lot better tools than I did when I first started having them. And so now it's like you feel that pressure start to build up. All right, I'm identifying that now. Like, what do I do? I have this set of tools that I use now to try to dissipate that built up pressure, right? And
Yeah.
then that's helped me kind of deal with the panic attacks, which is yeah, it's really helpful.
Yeah, and I used
No,
to
that's
have
cool.
panic attacks
That's
too.
cool.
They're terrible.
Yeah.
If anybody who's
Oh,
ever experienced panic attacks, it's the worst feeling you've ever had in the world. It's like
yeah.
it's
Yeah.
crazy.
Especially if you're anyway like a control freak, like I am a bit. When you feel out of control and there's nothing you can do to control it, that it's like the worst feeling in the world.
Mhm.
And that's anyway, that's my experience. It's been like it just yeah, it feels like you're out of control and there's nothing you can do to control it. And
And
that's
that's
a
a great
terrible feeling.
description because the people I've talked to with severe depression, it's the same thing. It's like, I know I
Mhm.
shouldn't feel this way. I know, I can see that other people are telling me there's positives, but there's no control. I don't have any control of
Yeah.
the way that I'm feeling. Like, no matter what, I feel this blackness, and it's that same feeling. It's just a different way of experiencing it. It comes out in a different way, but it's that same out of control feeling. So I'm glad you said that.
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, you can't really understand it unless you go through it. Because I was one of those people like before this happened, like, oh come on, like really just like pull yourself up and like take control of this and change your perception and just like get over it, buck up, like what's wrong with you? And but until when you start going through that kind of stuff, you realize, wow, people really don't have control of this. Like once it gets to that level, there's nothing you can do at that point in time really about it. Like you have to have good ways of identifying that stuff before it gets to that level and have tools to try to dissipate that and get and treat it right.
Absolutely, I agree. So, how would you diagnose? Somebody comes in. What's your typical way of diagnosing if somebody has depression? Do you have a certain technique
Yeah.
you use, or they say, "Oh, I'm sad," and you're like, "Oh, okay, here you go."
Well, so there are a lot of metabolic things that can lead to depression. So I always want to be sure like we go through that stuff. Like there are certain medical conditions and things like that that can contribute to depression. So I always start there first because it's a little easier to objectively assess things like thyroid conditions, nutritional deficiencies. I mean, vitamin D is freaking huge. I mean, we've
Hmm.
lived in Alaska, it's like the suicide rate there is double the rest of the country. Like vitamin D is a huge thing. But also, B vitamin deficiency, iron, omega 3s, like a lot of those can contribute to depression. If you have some type of chronic pain condition, fibromyalgia or chronic back pain or any of that kind of stuff, chronic pain is a huge one. It literally changes your brain and how your brain works, and depression can be part of that response. There are autoimmune conditions too that can, affect depression, MS, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis. There are a number of those. Other sort of neurological conditions, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, even after a stroke. Now I noticed this after my dad had a stroke a few years ago, and everybody noticed like his personality changed for a while.
Mhm.
Eventually, like he kind of came out of it, but it took a long time. I'd say like 1 to 2 years,
Yeah.
and that's pretty common to see that. Also for guys, hormonal imbalances like low testosterone. I mean, I can't tell you, and I've talked about this before. I can't tell you how many times I've seen guys come in on an antidepressant and they've never had their testosterone checked. That's a
Yeah.
no-brainer. And then in my opinion, that's malpractice for providers who don't do that. That's like I said, a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Sleep disorders. We've seen this a lot. When we worked in Alaska, a lot of guys worked up on the pipeline or they worked in the mine and they had all these like rotating schedules, where they're days for a week or two and then they take off for a few days and they're on nights and back and forth, and they end up they develop these sleep issues, right? And that's a huge one that can play into depression.
That's
But those are some of the big ones.
That's a really good point. And I think that another thing that happens with depression, in my experience, is that it affects your activities and it turns into a cycle where it's like you're depressed. And so you don't go out as much. You don't do the things that could help you because you're depressed. And when you don't do those things, you don't physically exercise, you don't get around other people, then your depression gets worse and it ends up feeding on itself.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. As far as workup goes, kind of going through those questions, like figuring out if there is an underlying condition, but getting some really good blood work, goes a long way. Checking your vitamin D status, checking your testosterone levels, that's kind of like, I call them tier 1 labs. It's kind of like that's the first step. And if nothing comes back there, you can kind of dig in deeper, especially if this has been a chronic kind of issue. You may want to dig deeper, and that's where you can look at, do some genetic testing. If I am
Mhm.
considering, especially with a guy, considering putting him on an antidepressant, I usually run some genetic testing to kind of give me a better idea of which antidepressant category is going to fit them better. And
Yep.
we've got some good genetic tests that can tell us that, because sometimes this can be driven by some variations in your ability to express certain enzymes and make neurotransmitters. And we
Yep.
can pick up on some of that with some genetic testing. Um, and then the other one is neurotransmitter testing. This one gets kind of tricky because we can test for the metabolites of like serotonin and dopamine and all those nice neurotransmitters. We just can't get to the active level of them, because we'd have to like bore into your brain and biopsy that out, which nobody's going to sign up for. So we have to look at when those neurotransmitters are broken down and then you pee them out. Basically, we can look at those metabolites. So it can sometimes give us a sense, especially if we can see consistent patterns. It gives us a better sense of maybe what's going on. But even that, it's controversial. It's tricky to try to interpret those
Mhm.
labs, but they're still possible, and you can use them for some purposes there. So that's kind of my general like workup, kind of working through those levels and seeing if we can figure out more of a root cause if we can. And if we can't identify more of a metabolic cause for this, then we can kind of start talking more about, all right, well, maybe this is just kind of genetic, or, there's just some issues with some of your neurotransmitters. Let's see how we can support those and see how you respond.
I'm glad you point that out because you actually helped me a lot. You probably don't even remember this. You helped me a lot with the genetic testing because when I had depression in college, the first thing they did is put me on SSRI. They didn't even assume there were
Yeah.
any other neurotransmitters that could, and this is a pet peeve of mine. No other
Mhm.
neurotransmitters could be involved, no other underlying conditions, no other blood tests, no questionnaires. They literally just said, here's Prozac, see how you feel. I got 100
Yeah.
times worse. Um,
Hmm.
you know, suicidal, high anxiety. And then you ran the genetic testing and found out that I wasn't properly breaking down serotonin. And I looked up the symptoms for serotonin syndrome, where you have a buildup
Hmm.
of serotonin. And that was all of the symptoms I was having on this, and SSRI, because what you're doing is you're inhibiting the reuptake of serotonin. So you have more serotonin flooding the brain and the body, which
Hmm.
then if you have a serotonin issue, that's going to help you. But the thing is,
Right.
we don't know if that's the issue. You can't just assume for everyone.
Yeah.
100% of guys the issue is serotonin. And I've seen a lot of doctors who just make that assumption, and it drives me
Yep.
nuts.
Yeah, that's totally true. And again, it goes back to like we don't have a great test for depression. We have questionnaires and we've got to like rule out certain things, but there's not a good test to just go, "Oh, yeah, you have depression and this is why." And so there's a lot of trial and error, and that takes time. It takes effort. It takes, a concerted effort between you and your provider, your doctor. And in our system, it just doesn't always work out that way, just because it does take time, and that's time is not something our system is set up to utilize. So
Can I say something controversial? Hopefully, I won't make anybody mad. I'm gonna
sure,
get
it's our
controversial
show.
here.
We can say whatever we want.
No, this is a controversial thing, but I wonder, and I won't say it is, but I wonder how much of this in America specifically is due to pharmaceutical reps pushing medications when they go to the doctor's office of like, hey, give out these free samples or prescribe this and see how people do, as opposed
Mhm,
to proper testing. And by the way, I'm not anti-medication. If you need an SSRI, then that is just fine. But first,
mhm.
you should see if you need the SSRI or the SNRI or whatever it is you're taking before going
Mhm.
that route, or at least have a good idea that everything else underlying is good before you just jump into that. So,
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a tough situation. It's like you got to put sometimes you got to put yourself in like your doctor's shoes, if you will. If they have 7 to 10 minutes with you and you come in and you're depressed, obviously, like you want an answer, right? And you want something that's going to help you quick. And it's really enticing when you have a rep come in and say, "Hey, here's the latest research on this medication. Here's some free samples. Give to your patients and try." Like, all right, boom, there you've got a solution that fits with your time frame. Like you've got limited time, so you want to provide a solution quickly, and it's not always the best solution, and it's not always the best timing of that solution either, where you again, you don't get putting someone on an SSRI still doesn't tell us like what's the issue, what's the problem. It's just kind of a trial and error approach. Well, let's just
yeah,
try this. If it works, if it doesn't, we'll try a different one. And and so on and so on.
no, that's great. That's actually really true because we have unfair expectations of our medical doctors sometimes. So, just
Yeah.
fix me right now. You have 10 minutes. I
Yeah.
need you to fix me.
Yeah, absolutely. And
I get
I
that
tell
too.
people all the time, like, "Hey, it's not my job to fix you. Like, this is your body. This is your responsibility. I'm gonna try to give you some education. We're gonna try to figure out what's going on, and where those issues are coming from. But it's still at the end of the day, it still boils down to you and doing all those foundational things you need to be healthy. What your diet look like, how you're sleeping, are you exercising, or are you just sitting on your ass all day? Do you have good coping skills, or are you drinking alcohol at the end of the day to kind of chill out and detach yourself from your problems? Like, that's on you. You got to take
Yeah,
your responsibility there yourself in order to make these changes and not depend on me. That's pressure that I'm not going to take on, because there's only so much I can do with you. Even if I see you for an hour, like once every 2 to 3 months, I mean, really, still, that's not enough time to make that kind of change. And I can
yeah.
just give you resources, right? You've got to be the one to decide what you're going to do with those resources.
Absolutely. And I tell people the same thing. It's like if they come into me and we're working on depression and they'll want to come in once every few months. And I'm just like, that's not going to work. Like, I need to see you twice a week in the beginning. Here's some
Mhm.
things I need you to do at home. Are you being physically active? And this is anecdotal, but the patients that I've had that deal the least with depression are people like farmers who are doing
Mhm.
physical labor. They're outside all day, they're in the sun all day, they have a job that's fulfilling them, and they're moving their body. And then those are
Yep.
the people that I tend to see with the least depression. So that should tell us at least something, at least anecdotally, that there's something to just movement and being in the sun. And
Yep. Yeah. I mean, there's even some really interesting, research on earthing, right? Or this grounding sort of technique, which is so funny that we give it a name of just like getting out and walking on the ground barefoot, but we've got to give it a name. And it's what, humans have been doing for most of human history, but now we have to like give it a special name. And anyway, but there's actually some pretty good evidence of like doing that and decreasing anxiety and depression, as the saying, like you were talking about, just getting out in nature, getting some fresh air, getting some sunlight. Like, we kind of take that for granted, but and it sounds too simple really to be effective, but it
yeah,
is if you're just consistent with it. I mean, we've honestly, like, if you think about it, you couldn't devise kind of a harsher environment than we have now. Like typically we have poor diets. We eat a lot of heavily processed food that's a lot of calories but doesn't have much nutrition. So we're we're we eat too many calories, but yet we're still nutrient deficient, which is a really interesting dichotomy there, right? And then we sit on our butts all day long, and then we don't sleep well, and then we have very poor coping skills. And it's like it's the perfect kind of scenario for all of these kind of issues, especially depression and anxiety.
No, I agree. And this is a little ironic coming from a podcast, but being able to put down your phone and put down your computer at times
Right.
and just
Yeah.
because how much of our time do we get on social media, and it's just people complaining about how much they hate everything. That's most of social media is just like
Yeah.
this person sucks, these people suck, this is how my life sucks. And it's like,
Mhm.
no wonder we're depressed. I mean, between food and not being outside and then just seeing negative all the time, no sleep, it's like
Yeah.
it makes sense. So I think you're
Yeah.
right on of looking at all these other causes, fixing the things you can fix at home, and then
Mhm.
seeing and then looking at the blood test and then seeing like, okay, is there still depression there? Oh, it's improving, or oh, it's the same. And then you get a better idea of what direction to go in.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you you made a great point. It actually makes me think of my grandmother. I remember when I think I was a teenager or something, but she said something to the effect of, "You are who you surround yourself with." Like
Mm,
you're kind of the result of, what kind of people you surround yourself with. And that includes like now social media. Like we didn't have it then, but social media is the same thing. Like if you just consume a lot of negative, information all the time, then what do you think is going to be the result of that? Yeah, you're going to have a pretty dire outlook on life, and you're going to get depressed more versus, you know, putting people around you in your life that are positive, they're optimistic, they're active, they're looking to better themselves. Like those are the kind of people that are likely going to feed into your life and help you like live a better life.
absolutely. And I do want to say for all our listeners, we're not telling you if you're on a medication right now and you're depressed just to stop. We're not saying that. Like I would
Oh yeah.
say,
Yeah.
talk to your doctor, talk to your practitioner. If you don't have a doctor that's listening to you, then talk to Dr. May, see if you can get in for an appointment with him. But really see about your options. We're not just going to be like, oh, just cut out all the medications. But you start
Mhm.
to improve these things in your life, and those things improve, then you have a good idea of kind of some of the underlying causes, which is really what we're trying to get at.
100%, Mike. Yeah. And guys are the worst about stopping medication cold turkey. And I promise you, these are not the type of medications you want to stop cold turkey.
Ever.
That actually significantly increases risk of suicide within the first 30 days after stopping them. They have to be titrated down a certain way. And I do this with a lot of men and a lot of people just in general, like sort of de-prescribing their antidepressant as we kind of learn like what other things that are going on and we're supporting those other areas. Then when they feel like they're in a good place, then you feel strong, you feel like, all right, I have good tools, good coping skills, things like that. Now that's the time when you can start slowly titrating off of your antidepressant. But
Yeah.
if you're in a bad place and you think, oh, this stuff is just not working, that's still not a good scenario for you to discontinue that.
Yeah, and I've actually worked with Dr. May before where I'll treat somebody with acupuncture and Chinese herbs perhaps for depression, and Dr. May will work with them. And then it's this joint effort with everyone to make sure that you're safe, you're doing it right. And if you're going to get off any medications, it's not going to affect where you're at with depression. We want to make sure that you are healthy, happy, exactly where you need to be. So.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, Mike, I'm curious, how would you treat with acupuncture and Chinese medicine? Like, how would you treat depression?
Well, I definitely wouldn't drill into the brain to check the check the neurotransmitters.
Yeah.
Um, but really, it's nice because even though I do have a psychology background, the Chinese medicine perspective is just completely different. So I'm gonna look at the tongue and pulse. I'm going to see what situational things are going on in their life, physical activity, water intake, sleep, stress that you can eliminate, because a lot of times we subject ourselves to stress that you don't have to have. And then usually I'll give them, if they're seeing me in person, I'll give them an acupuncture treatment plan that involves at least twice a week for a couple weeks. If they're not seeing me in person or they're far away, then we talk, there's some really good Chinese herbs. There's one called Xiaoyasan, which the English name is Free and Easy Wanderer. I love that name.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. That's a good
Yeah.
one.
And it's
Yeah.
just really good for somebody who has liver qi stagnation, that like stress, irritability, depression. Really, really good at just leveling things out very gently and very nicely. I'll talk diet with people. People don't think about diet, but if you're eating junk food all day and you're having huge, blood sugar spikes, and then you're having this insulin, it's just up and down, that will absolutely affect, your mood. That will affect your depression. That will affect anxiety. So I'm going to talk a lot of lifestyle stuff with people, Chinese herbs, if things have gone further. So you've been having this for a long time. You may also have some spleen and stomach deficiency. That in Chinese medicine, the liver beats up on everything. It's like the Mike Tyson of of the body, and it just beats up everything. And what'll end up happening is you'll start to get digestive issues. The emotion you'll get is worry, of like, I'm always worried about everything. And I've met people like this where it's just like, I just can't stop thinking about all the things that I'm worried about. And, it's always going through my mind in a loop. Then a lot of times I'll also prescribe something for the spleen and stomach deficiency. But almost always kind of the liver is the first line. And then down the road, it starts to affect other body systems.
Gotcha. That's interesting.
But yeah, Free and Easy Wanderer is good. Specific herb is called Chai Hu. Really, really good formula, or really, really good herb for depression in general. So that's Buplorum from the Western, and it's really good for liver qi stagnation and depression. We'll also do Dongui, which is angelica, and licorice can be really good. Ginger root too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Those are some great ones.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah. So I'm totally on board with all that. I do the same thing. Like, hey, how much are you exercising? What's your diet look like? How are you sleeping? What are your coping skills as far as stress goes? But also for guys too, we tend to be a little bit more isolational, right? And so we don't have sort of community like women often do. So I'll often encourage guys to look at some support groups. And I know support group is kind of like a 4-letter word for guys. Like, all right, let's look for a group of other guys that have similar interests than you. Okay. And that might be like the shooting club, or, some kind of sporting activity, or whatever. So like join one of those groups, and then also find ways to develop your own emotional literacy. And this is just like learning to recognize and articulate your feelings. And that can be a really powerful tool to kind of managing your mental health. And that's where, like I said, I often recommend that book, Emotional Intelligence, just to kind of work through that, get some counseling, learn some cognitive behavioral therapy or some other kind of mindfulness kind of based therapy that helps you like deal with stress in the moment so that it doesn't build up and overflow later on to something more significant.
Yeah.
And
And that's what
then,
most counselors are practicing now, is cognitive behavioral therapy. It's the most common
yeah.
psychological technique that's being practiced. So
Yeah, and it's powerful. I mean, it's just a way to sort of reinterpret what you're seeing. Because again, like we have our perceptions of reality, right? But oftentimes it's not reality, right? It's just how we've perceived what's going on in our world. And oftentimes that can just it's wrong. It's completely wrong. It's like talking to your wife back and forth, and she's hearing something different than what you're actually saying, right? And so like you misinterpret it. And so sometimes you need perspective, right? And so perception is one thing, perspective is a completely different thing. It's someone's outside sort of look at the situation that can give you a different idea of maybe how to interpret that differently And that gives you insight as to how you're dealing with this too. So
Mhm.
I think some counseling and developing those skills is really great. And then as far as like herbs and things like that, I love what you were talking about. Ginger is great. Licorice is awesome, especially if you've got some adrenal issues going on. In the right space, I do like things that kind of help with serotonin if that's kind of the issue. So 5-HTP, St. John's wort, those are some really common ones. SAM E, omega 3s, saffron, rhodiola, those are some great herbs. In this kind of state too, like sometimes guys do really well with adaptogens,
Mhm.
and adaptogens are just herbs that kind of help your body adapt to stress. And so rhodiola is kind of one of those. Ashwagandha's another great
Oh, actually,
one.
I was gonna mention that.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, tribulus for guys tends to be pretty well because it helps kind of with their libido as well. Anyway, so those are some great ones to kind of start with. Be careful with St. John's wort or 5-HTP if you're already on an antidepressant because of their effects on serotonin and how it's metabolized. But so you're gonna have to work through that with your provider. But yeah, those are some great starting points, and then you just kind of keep working the problem. And this is the other issue. It's like, your first visit or two, like when you're getting information and you're trying to formulate a treatment strategy, like it's not going to be perfect the first time, guys. Like, don't expect it to be. This is a process that's going to take time. It's probably taken you years or a lifetime to get to this point. You're not going to fix this overnight. And so you've got to sort of adjust your expectations. This may take weeks or months to actually get down to the root issue and start making some significant progress the right direction. But I guarantee
Absolutely.
you keep at it, you're going to figure it out. It's just sometimes it takes time.
I agree. And I'm glad you mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy. It sounds all fancy, but really it's just, being able to identify, the first thing you have to do is be aware of your own thoughts, which sometimes we are not, of
Mhm.
actually identifying those thoughts and then, restructuring and reframing that into something that's not that negative. But if you're not talking to somebody or if you're not emotionally intelligent, you're talking about emotional intelligence, you aren't able to identify the negative thoughts in the first place. And if you can't identify it, you can't change it.
Yep.
So that's a huge part of all of this is like, yes, there's a lot of physical stuff you can be doing, but we also have to work on our mind, how we think about things.
Mhm.
And I have a personal story for that. I used to be, when I was in high school, the most negative person you've ever met. Everything was the worst possible thing could happen. And then when I was in college in psychology, I just decided, no, I'm not going to be like that anymore. And so I started working on identifying these negative cycles I had and then changing it to positive. And over
Mhm.
time, it changed. And all of a sudden people would be like, you're really positive. Why are you so happy? Why are you so positive? And it's because, and some of that was also, I started sleeping better. I started eating better food. I started exercising, but mixed in with identifying thoughts and changing them, all of a sudden my perspective changed. Now, my environment, other than the stuff I was doing didn't change. There were still the same people around me. There was still the same world that we live in, but the way
Mhm.
I thought about it was different and the way I framed it was different. So there is hope.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. I love it. I'll do the same thing. I'll sometimes really try to get guys to do just a gratitude journal, and not like you don't have to write it out, but just put in your phone every day. Like change your perspective by trying to identify like what are you grateful for? What are you thankful for in your life? Like what are the good things in your life? And just sometimes changing that perspective from what's bad in your life, what sucks in your life, which is what we tend to kind of gravitate towards. Just that little switch right there can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. And I know we're almost at the end here, but I do want to say, and I'm going to speak directly to you guys listening. Anybody that's listening and you're dealing with depression, and maybe you don't want to call it that. I'm sad all the time. I think about all these negative things all the time. You think about hurting yourself sometimes, whatever it is. Do not sit there and just ignore it. Like,
Mhm.
even if it's just emailing Dr. May and I, or if it's just talking to us or talking to your doctor, or talking to a counselor, make sure you're talking to somebody because it doesn't seem like a big deal until it is. So deal with it now, get help. We're here for you. There's other people here for you, but don't ignore it. You're not alone. So get out there and absolutely do something.
Amen, brother. That's a great way to end. Awesome. Guys, yeah, reach out to us if we can help in any way. Yeah, we're just, this is the whole point of this podcast, is just trying to bring to light issues and things, especially in men's lives, that don't get talked about much. So
Yeah.
yeah, we're here to help as best we can.
And thank you all for listening. Tell your friends, and we look forward to helping you all next week.
All right. Peace out, guys. Until next time. See ya.